one-year sabbatical. And the first part of that sabbatical I'm spending here in Australia with the Australian Rivers Institute over in Nathan campus of Griffith to learn a little bit more about healthy land and water. And that's because there are things that they've managed to do in terms of implementing their monitoring program that we haven't. And some of the things that we're sort of a few steps further back, and that's what I want to tell you about today. My co-author on this work is Mike van den Heuvel from the Biology Department of the University of Prince Edward Island. And any mistakes in this presentation are his fault, and all the rest of it is mine. This business of cumulative effects assessment, I want to say a little bit about, just to set the context. This is a really big deal in Canada right now. And that's because when Justin Trudeau, a couple of years ago when he was campaigning to be our next Prime Minister, which of course he now is, he said that he wanted to restore a gutted environmental review process. And that was part of his vision for enhancing the Canadian economy. What he was talking about was his predecessor, Stephen Harper, who was the Prime Minister, put through, 3 years previous to that, had put through a large omnibus bill which included streamlining, as they said, of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, the Fisheries Act, and some other major pieces of legislation. What that was really all about was things like pipelines, major national projects, pipelines for moving bitumen from Alberta to tidewater on each of our two coasts. Big projects like that, not just pipelines, but also dams and so on. And the idea was to try to speed that process up and to streamline it, make it happen faster. In fact, it had exactly the opposite effect, because the Canadian public lost confidence in the review process, in the ability of both government and industry to protect the environment, and so they stopped major projects happening. And so this didn't help either the economy or the environment, in fact. So that's what this whole thing was about. So as soon as Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, he named an expert panel and asked them to produce recommendations on how we might restore, bless you, how they might restore confidence of the Canadian public in the review process for projects that we do. And so the panel got together, and in April of 2017, they reported out with a number of recommendations. Scarcely 2 months later than that, the federal government came out with a discussion paper which talked about how they plan to address those recommendations. And that document is really exciting because it says things like this. This is one page out of it. And they talk about strategic and regional assessments in order to be able to address cumulative effects. Just the fact that these words, regional assessment, strategic assessment, cumulative effects, are being used in a government document is a huge step ahead. Now, whether it'll happen, we don't know. There has been legislation that is being discussed at the moment. We haven't seen it, but we're very optimistic. But this, of course, is something that many of us have been talking about for 20 plus years, in fact. So the Canadian Water Network, a group that I worked with for some years, had done quite a lot of work on this. The Canadian Water Network is an independent water research and knowledge brokering group based at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. And it does all things water. So it's a lot of municipal issues, drinking water, wastewater treatment, flood control. But it also thinks a lot about watershed management and better integrated watershed management. And that's the part that I want to tell you about. In 2009-2010, the incoming scientific director, Kelly McKittrick, working with the executive director, Bernadette Conan, did a survey of people who have to make decisions on environmental assessments and management around water. People from the provinces, people from federal government, people from industry. And they asked them, what is stopping you from doing your job better? What is slowing you down? And the answer came back, we have this legal obligation to do something on cumulative effects assessment. We don't really know what that is. We don't think we're doing it right. And we don't think we're collecting the right kind of data to do it. And so that became one of the elements that became part of something called the Canadian Watershed Research Consortium that the Canadian Water Network developed. The other thing that became part of it was this paper in 2006 by Peter Dunker from Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada, and Lauren Gregg in Ontario. And they did a review of how we do cumulative effects assessment in Canada. And they concluded that while there's been a lot of talk, a lot of definitions and principles about how this should work, it in fact hasn't made any difference to how we protect valued ecosystem components. And what they thought we needed to do was we need to move towards regional environmental assessment and regional environmental monitoring frameworks. And so there we are again with this idea that we need to understand the region. What they're talking about is at the moment in Canada, when you do a major project, if you're going to build a pulp mill, you think about the impacts that the pulp mill may have on the environment. And then as a last step, you think about the cumulative effects, where you say, well, in addition to the pulp mill, there's also a refinery over here, and there's dredging going on in the harbor, and there's climate change. So in aggregate, our effects plus everybody else's will add up to Y, and over time, it'll add up to Z. So the problem with that is, first of all, we almost never go back and find out whether our predictions were right. But on the few occasions where we have, they haven't been. Our ability to make good predictions that way is very low. So what these guys are saying is, instead of that, what we need to do is we need to understand a region and what drives change in the things that we care about in that region, in the valued ecosystem components. So stressor effect pathways, that's what they're talking about. So Lauren was talking to Kelly about this just at the time that Kelly was the incoming scientific director for the Canadian Water Network, and that plus those consultations that Kelly and Bernadette did resulted in this thing called the Canadian Watershed Research Consortium in 2010. The idea was, if we don't know how to do cumulative effects, monitoring and support of cumulative effects assessment, let's learn by doing. Let's take half a dozen places across the country that have a need and capacity to be able to build a partnership and a monitoring framework. Let's give them some seed money over 3 years to do the research to develop this thing. And these are intended to be legacy projects. These are intended to be things that the partnership and the monitoring framework will continue on beyond the funding from the Canadian Water Network. I'm going to come back to this slide at the end of the talk and say, now that we're beyond that funding, did that actually happen? So we'll come back to that. It was always in Kelly's mind that there were 4 steps to how we would get to cumulative effects assessment. The first is you need to develop a consistent set of monitoring indicators that support cumulative effects assessment and collect the baseline data. The second is you need to develop a set of triggers. So once you have that baseline data, this is the range of normal in that whatever the indicator is that you've developed. When you get to the edge of that range of normal, that can become a trigger for either further monitoring to tell you why things have changed, or a management measure to do something about it. The third step is to develop a series of relationships that link the drivers to the responses. So we have some predictive power. If this changes, if this environmental pressure changes, how does that change your indicator? And with all of that, you can then develop a cumulative effects assessment model. The main point here is that it was always the intent of the Canadian Watershed Research Consortium just to do that first step, just to have these 6 groups develop a set of monitoring indicators and collect baseline data and the recommendations for how you do that. So, the Watershed Research Consortium began with a pilot project, one of the 6, to show the others how it's done. And that was chosen to be the St. John Harbour. St. John Harbour is in New Brunswick on the east coast of Canada in the Bay of Fundy. It's a large port for us, not nearly as large as Brisbane, but it's a large port. And it was an area that was projected to see a lot of environmental change because it was going to be an energy hub. There's a nuclear reactor in the area that was talked about a second. There's liquefied natural gas. There's talk about expansion. There's an oil refinery, the largest in Canada, talk about expansion of that. So many things were projected to change, and therefore a really good place to be thinking about cumulative effects. The other reason this was chosen as the pilot was because the Canadian Rivers Institute has a base at the University of New Brunswick in St. John. And so they were able to provide the administrative support to make this thing happen, which is really important. So they brought together the partners, everybody doing monitoring, regulating monitoring, or benefiting from monitoring, to sit around the table, governments of all levels, industry, environmental groups, and talk about what they wanted to protect. What were they concerned about? What were their valued ecosystem components? And they decided that they were concerned with the fish, the benthic invertebrates, and contaminants in both the sediment and the biota for St. John Harbour. So they drew a line across here for where they were concerned with, and then they set 6 stations, 6 reference stations, areas that they thought should not be impacted by anything directly. 3 in the inner harbor, 3 in the outer harbor, and they collected sediment using a dredge, using a grab, and the sediment samples were divided in half. Half goes to contaminant analysis, half goes to benthic invertebrate analysis. For the fish, it proved difficult to get enough fin fish of any 1 or 2 species to be able to do the analyses that we wanted. So instead we went towards cage bivalves. These are blue mussels that you can hang out in frames for 2 or 3 months in the harbor and get indices of growth, survival, and reproduction as well as contaminant uptake. And all of that was intended to do something like this. So this is just talking about arsenic levels in the sediment. And you've got your 3 inner harbor stations, your 3 outer harbor stations, and each of them measured at 6 different times over 2 years. So that gives you an idea of spatial and temporal variation. And so that's what the mean plus 2 standard deviations, which is what they chose as their range of normal, looks like for the inner harbor. That's what it looks like for the outer harbor, or if you're just concerned with the whole harbor, it looks like that. So you could use those then as your trigger point. And that then is the background information and potential trigger points that could be used. So that was St. John Harbour as the pilot project. Then there was a competition for the other sites that would join St. John Harbour to be part of this Canadian Watershed Research Consortium. And the other sites were Northumberland Strait, and that's the one that I want to tell you about today, because that's the one that Mike and I were most directly involved in the research on. There were 2 sites in Ontario, the Grand River, that's where the University of Waterloo is, and Muskoka, one in Manitoba, Tobacco Creek, and then through a different process a year later, another site came along in the Northwest Territories, the Slave Lake and Delta, and through still a different process a year later, the Murray River came along in British Columbia in the Rockies, and that's all about coal mining impacts. So that then is the Canadian Watershed Research Consortium. The one I want to tell you about is this one, Northumberland Strait. So this is Prince Edward Island, this is New Brunswick, this is Nova Scotia, and this body of water here is Northumberland Strait. And right here, there's a bridge that was built in the mid-90s. And that's the Confederation Bridge, and that's where the story starts on this. When they were coming to build this bridge, they gathered together all the information that they had on the environment and on fisheries and so on. And one of the things they found was that some of the major fisheries were in decline and the environment was in decline. So this is lobster landings in the central area of Northumberland Strait, and you can see they're in decline. That's when the bridge was built. So it's not because of the building of the bridge, but nevertheless, and this is herring showing the same sort of thing. So it wasn't because of the building of the bridge, but there was something changing. So the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, responsible for this area, brought together an exercise of stakeholder interviews to find out what people thought was happening, what were their concerns. And that resulted in this 2007 Ecosystem Overview report. Now that report made a lot of recommendations about what information we needed to be able to better understand the changes that were happening in the environment of Northumberland Strait and in the commercial resources and so on. So for example, that drove the research for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and actually for Environment Canada, another federal department that does things in the coastal zone, for the next 5 years. And they did a lot of great work. They did a lot of basic oceanography. This is temperatures in August in Northumberland Strait. Primary production through fluorescence, secondary production, the zooplankters in the strait, fish distributions. So a lot of great information like that. There was a repeat of a contaminant survey of sediment that had been done earlier, so we can compare. But there was one recommendation made by that report that was not addressed by DFO or by Environment Canada, and that was analysis of the surrounding watershed to look at nutrients and other materials coming into the strait from the watersheds via the estuaries. And that was felt to be a critical gap. And the thing that stakeholders talked about again and again and again were nutrients, contaminants, and sediments. And of course, that's true in Moreton Bay. It's true everywhere in the world. That's the big land impacts, these 3 things. And the challenge is to understand how the things that we're doing on land are affecting the estuaries with these things, and then on into Northumberland Strait. So that was talked about in a workshop the next year in which the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, this is the major body that funds biophysical research in Canada, concluded that research is needed on pathways linking land use to aquatic effects. And Northumberland Strait was used as an example where we were talking about effects of land-based activities on aquatic resources. One of the other things, though, and I just want to mention this because this is a tie to the reason that I'm actually here in Australia right now, is when we were talking about this and trying to sell people on Northumberland Strait as being one of the nodes in the Canadian Watershed Research Consortium, I think it's really important that people be able to think about, if we did that, what would that do for us? Where would we be in 5 years? And the example that I really liked was Moreton Bay, was the healthy Moreton Bay Waterways and Catchment Partnership, or Healthy Waterways as it was then, Healthy Land and Water now. And we talked about the 2008 report card. We talked about this amazing monitoring program that had been developed with 127 freshwater sites, 248 sites in the estuarine and marine environments. We talked about how the things that they were concerned with protecting, eelgrass, seagrasses, being concerned about nuisance algal blooms, losing sensitive fish and invertebrates, they were all exactly the same things that we were concerned with. And we talked about, and this is the part that I'm really here for, is how they managed to link management decisions to the monitoring data collected. So it wasn't just collecting information to better understand the environment. This was collecting information to inform decisions and do true information-informed decision-making. That's what they managed to do. So that was actually really important to fire people up. So in bringing together this partnership for Northumberland Strait, we followed the St. John model. We began by bringing together government. And that's provincial governments, and remember there's three, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, but there's also federal government, multiple departments, and indigenous governments as well, First Nation government. Fortunately, they were all represented on one group called the Regional Committee on Coastal and Ocean Management, or RCOM. And so we went to RCOM and we said, we're thinking about bringing together a partnership of everyone doing monitoring, regulating monitoring, being affected by monitoring, to make decisions, to develop a monitoring framework, and then building the framework in the partnership. And if we did that, is that consistent with where you see things going in integrated management in the coastal zone? Would you support that? And they said yes. So we said, great. With that, we were able to bring in industry, and that was a bit complicated too, because each of the three provinces has its own industry groups, and it's forestry, it's agriculture, it's aquaculture, it's peat moss harvesting, which we still do in New Brunswick. It's all of these things. And we brought in some environmental, non-governmental organizations. One, an umbrella group that thinks about all of the watersheds and some individual watersheds within the area that we were concerned. So we all sat around a table, and we talked about what was the area that we were concerned with protecting. And the group drew a broad line that covered all of Prince Edward Island. The reason they did that was they said that even things that happen on the north side of Prince Edward Island can affect Northumberland Strait here. And so they drew the line quite broadly. The second thing we did was we shared with each other the monitoring that we're already doing. Because what we were thinking about in this framework that we wanted to build was not another level, another responsibility for everyone, but rather integrating all the things that we're already doing. So we can identify redundancies and identify gaps and be addressing those. The other thing that we did to help us think about what we were concerned with protecting was we used the DIPSR model that the European Environment Agency had used. And I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but basically DIPSR is driver, pressure, state, impact, and then responses. So if you're thinking about nutrients, one of our big impacts, one of the big drivers is agriculture, and we'll be talking about that, which puts nitrogen and phosphorus into the environments of pressure. And the state that changes is potentially eutrophication or hypoxia, resulting in some impacts that we may not be comfortable with. Loss of eelgrass, algal blooms, hypoxia, losing invertebrates, losing some of the fish, and so on. So we worked through that for the big three things that the stakeholders talked about, the sediments, nutrients, and contaminants. And when we did that, not surprisingly, the things that we were concerned with protecting in our estuaries were the plants, the fish, and the invertebrates, just like Moreton Bay. So the reason to do all of that, it seems a bit pedantic, but the reason to do all of that is that later on when people come back and say, how did you end up with what you did? We've got a track. We know how those decisions were made. So we can actually go back to this. Armed with that, the partnership was able to put out a request for research proposals in which they said, we need to understand pathways between activities on land, which introduce sediments, nutrients, and contaminants into the watercourses, and effects on fish, invertebrates, and plants in the estuaries of Northumberland Strait region. There was a competition, and the winners of that competition were this motley crew with Mike Van Den Heuvel from the University of Prince Edward Island leading and thinking mostly about the biology of the proposal. Kerry McQuarrie from the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, who did nutrient work, and André Saint-Hilaire from the National Research Institute in Quebec, who did the sediment work. And their proposal was called Towards a Regional Monitoring Framework for Cumulative Impacts Assessment in the Northumberland Strait, linking land use stressor loads with nearshore biological integrity. The first thing to say about that proposal was they addressed two of the three things that the stakeholders said they were concerned with, nutrients and sediments. Contaminants, they said, was a bridge too far for biting off initially. But what they did say was they said they would go back and try to find additional funding to do that at a later time. And in fact, that has happened. Mike subsequently got another grant, and the contaminants work is going on at the moment. We won't talk about that today. For the nutrients and sediments work, there were 3 elements to their proposal. The first was to quantify land-based stressors. Nutrients, focusing mostly nitrogen, and sediments, and suspended sediment. Then, developing indicators of estuarine health. How do you know if your estuary is healthy? And they talked about looking at indices of health of seagrasses. We only have the one species, Ostromarina, eelgrass, and using the International Seagrass Net protocols to look at health indices. Mapping out the area, the extent of eelgrass and sea lettuce that we have in our estuaries, because there's a lot of concern that we're losing eelgrass and it's being replaced by opportunistic annual algae, alga. Phytoplankton blooms in late summer, the state of oxygen in both the sediment and the water. Abundance of grazers, snails and amphipods, things that under a balanced condition might be able to keep algal blooms in check. And fish community. The fish community was not actually part of the Northumberland Strait work. That was something that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans had developed 10 years earlier. It's a beach seining program that looks at the nekton, the fish, the shrimp, the crabs, near shore, at 6 different places in each of 36 estuaries throughout the Southern Gulf of St. Lawrence. So there's an extensive database on that. That actually was a separate part, but that was what was going to be used for the fish. And then taking these 2 things, the stressors and the indices of health, and using that to build stressor-based models of estuarine impact, incorporating circulation and tidal flushing, and linking back to Northumberland Strait. So that was the proposal. As we went through this, of course, a number of other people became involved in this work. And I want to draw particular attention to all of the indented people. These are all students, except for Christina, who's the technician who worked with us on this. And it's their work. Of course, it's always the students who do the work. It's their work that I'll be telling you about today. So, getting into some of what this is all about, what we knew already going in was that eutrophication was a big issue. This is a map of Prince Edward Island showing some of the land use, and agriculture is huge on Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward is one of our 10 provinces in Canada. We have 10 provinces and 3 territories. It's the smallest province. It's only got 140,000 people living there, but it's mostly agriculture. So it's our most highly agricultural province in Canada. And what we're concerned about is eelgrass beds turning to sea lettuce blooms, alga blooms, that become like this, and then you get die-off of this, which uses up tremendous amounts of oxygen, and you get this. So this is a picture of the sediment after an anoxic event. And you can see that clams, polychaetes, everything in the sediment, as well as everything in the water column, has died. So there's a lot of concern about that. And we also knew that nutrient recycling within the estuaries was something that we didn't understand at all. The impacts of sediments we knew was important as well, although we had much less information on that. Because of agriculture, as in the Brisbane watershed, you've got tremendous erosion, putting more and more sediment into the water. So that also is a concern. So what did we measure? For the stressor, for the nutrients, we looked at external load and flow in over 50 streams, and sediment turbidity, we focused on 6 watersheds. For the estuarine health indicators, we took a group of 17 estuaries that spanned the range of what we thought as most impacted to least impacted to work on, and most of the indices were collected in all of those. Most of the sites were actually on Prince Edward Island, only 5 were not. There's 3 sites in New Brunswick, and there's 2 sites in Nova Scotia. The focus was on Prince Edward Island. That's because we already knew that's where most of the problems were. So, direct measures of nitrogen loading. This is the work of Pierre Grizzard, working with Kerry McQuarrie. And what he showed was that loading, not surprisingly, and this is what we kind of already knew, was highest in the agricultural watersheds of Prince Edward Island. And it was very high, much higher than you see in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And in fact, for the nitrogen coming into the area, about 97% is coming from Prince Edward Island rather than the other provinces. He did some modeling, and modeling has its limitations, but his conclusion from the modeling that he was able to do was that about 91% is coming from agriculture, only about 4% from domestic septic systems, and over half of the total nitrogen is coming from potato production. Most of Prince Edward Island is about producing potatoes. Potatoes use a lot of nutrients as well as biocides. So that's where a lot of this is coming from, and a lot of it is coming through delayed loadings, which means it's cycling through the groundwater before it's coming back into the watersheds. For sediment, we used a couple of different nephelometers, basically measuring the reflectance of light by sediment in the water. And this is the work of Ashley Alberto, working with Mike and me at the University of Prince Edward Island. And she was able to develop a relationship between the amount of sediment that we see in water and the amount of agriculture that we see in those watersheds. It wasn't simple, though. It turned out that the way that you calibrate these things is really important. One usually calibrates them by mixing up the sediment that you find at the bottom of the stream and then filtering them and doing a relationship between the turbidity as measured by this and the actual sediment in the water. That turns out not to be really good. If you do an auto-sampler to collect samples during a rain event, you get different sediment than you get if you use the bottom. So the calibration turns out to be really important. That's one thing she found. The other thing she found was that you only see this relationship if you take into consideration the size of the rain event, season, and a number of other factors. So the modeling is not that simple. Zachary Sirabahenda, working with Andre Saint-Hilaire at ENRS, was able to develop a nice model in which he could predict total suspended sediment using precipitation, water flow, and watershed vulnerability, an index that he developed, which is mostly about how much agriculture there is in that watershed. And that work will continue, but there was also some work that was done with ADCPs, acoustic Doppler current profilers, and these have some advantages over the nephelometers in how you measure sediment in the water. They can be used for current measurement, but they can also be used for measuring how much sediment you have in the water. So there is some work that is proceeding on ADCPs to measure sediments in Prince Edward Island. For oxygen, this is the work of Mike Coffin. Mike did some initial surveys in which he looked at the estuary and broke the estuary up into the top of the estuary, the top 10% area, 50%, 100%, and did some transects by June through November down through the water column. And you can see that you have, once you get into summer, you're getting some very low levels of oxygen, hypoxia or anoxia, and particularly in the upper 10%. It's really in the head of the estuary where you're seeing these events. And this told us that we really needed to study that area. So what we were lucky about was at just about this time, these new optical oxygen loggers came on the market, which changed everything. The way we used to measure oxygen was with a chemical procedure, but in many of our estuaries with high sulfur levels, they fouled. And so it's difficult to maintain that. With the optical oxygen loggers, they're relatively inexpensive. You can put these things out and you can collect this kind of information, hourly levels of oxygen at wherever in the water column you wanted. So what Mike did was he put these loggers out up at the top of the estuary, the top 10% area and at the 50% area, and got data like this. This is showing the temperature from June through December and an oxygen level in what we call the good estuary. And you can see it bounces around a bit with diurnal and lunar tides, but it's always pretty good. You contrast that to what you see in an estuary that is not so good. This is the Kildare in Prince Edward Island. And by August, you're seeing levels that are reaching zero. And that continues much longer than we thought. That continues on into November, December. So this is telling us, we also saw those sorts of events in many more estuaries than we thought. So this is the kind of information that we really need to see. Mike developed a huge number of oxygen indices. How long, how many hours an area was below 4 milligrams per liter, how many hours it was over 10 in this month and that month and so on, and threw them all into a principal components analysis. And when he did that, he found something really interesting. One of the more influential things was how many hours the estuaries are less than 4 milligrams per liter, and how many hours they're over 10. And these two things are orthogonal to each other, meaning they're telling you about something different. So less than 4 is hypoxia, moving towards anoxia. Over 10 is supersaturation, which you get in a lot of these estuaries. So Mike was able to use this, and he was able to develop models where he looked at, for the hypoxia, the time under 4 milligrams per liter, relating it to the nitrate, how much nitrogen is going into the estuary, and residence time. This is all about flushing. And was able to get a pretty good relationship. If he replaced the time under 4 milligrams per liter with eutrophic time, that's that combined measure of less than 4 and over 10, the relationship's not quite so good, but in some ways that's a more useful index. And so that's also a pretty significant relationship. With chlorophyll, we didn't see relationships nearly this strong. So it seems like this may be something that we can work towards. What we also realize is that in sort of following in the tracks of healthy land and water, healthy waterways, which became healthy land and water, we're going to need to develop report cards. And this may be an index that we can do that with. It turns out these things are fairly normally distributed. So if you simply took the quartiles and said, for an estuary that is very little in the eutrophic time, it's very little over 10 or less than 4, these estuaries would fall into that area, which we might call good. And some estuaries are a lot of the time in that area, so we might call those bad. So this is something we may be able to move towards. In terms of the invertebrate work, Mike Coffin, the PhD student, also did quite a lot of work looking at invertebrates and whether they might be a useful indicator for us for eutrophic status in estuaries. And he found, as other people have, that we get different communities of invertebrates in eelgrass than we do in sea lettuce. More interestingly, though, he found that in the estuaries that are dominated by sea lettuce, when you have an oxygen sag, you find a change in the community of animals in that area, going from being dominated by gammarid amphipods to being dominated by snails. And so there may be something there that could be useful for us. We'll come back to that. Jess Hitchcock was a master's student working with us who looked at eelgrass. And she did two things. She looked at health indices and she looked at aerial coverage. For the health indices, she found that when you look at, this is the head of the estuary moving down to the ocean down here, that there was a tremendous amount of variance in the health indicators through the estuary as you go down the salinity gradient. In fact, more variance than you find between estuaries. And so that makes it a bit difficult, unless you're going to do some sort of stratification, that makes it a bit difficult to use as an indicator of health. What we think may be more helpful is the aerial extent. How much eelgrass do you in fact have? And so what we would hope is that we could plot out something like the percent occupancy of suitable habitat. So there are areas in the estuary where you can get eelgrass and where you can't. How much of that area are actually being used by eelgrass? So we've collected data from 16 estuaries, and the analysis is in progress at the moment. We already know that it's not going to be a simple relationship. Light attenuation is hugely important, and that's related to the sediment and the amount of phytoplankton and the color of the water. So there are a number of things that are going to have to be done there, but we think that there may be something here. All right, enough results. If we go back to that slide that I showed earlier, when Kelly was talking about building this Canadian Watershed Research Consortium, and we go back to this idea that these were to be legacy projects, that the partnership and the monitoring framework were to persist beyond the 3 years of Canadian Water Network funding. Was it successful? Did it work? Well, the answer on the partnership part is no. And that's interesting to me. That's part of the reason I'm here, is to try to understand that better. While we were doing this exercise, we brought these people together, and the whole intent, the whole Canadian Water Network aim, was to keep the stakeholders in control of the program, not the scientists. Keep the people who will use the information to make decisions guiding the program. So every 6 months, we convened a meeting, we bought sandwiches, got everybody sat down, and the researchers had to tell the stakeholders what they'd done in the last 6 months and what they plan to do in the next 6 months. And the stakeholders could then ask questions, they could reshuffle things, sites were changed, they were very engaged. And we had people on that group, some were very sophisticated, they were park biologists and things. We had people on that group say they had never encountered this before and they thought it was absolutely fantastic. They thought this was the way to go. Yet, when the funding stopped and we were no longer buying the sandwiches, nobody picked this up. Nobody picked it up and said, we've got to keep this thing going. That's very interesting to me. We need to understand that better. The message on the monitoring program is a bit happier. The monitoring program, nearly all of the recommendations made were actually picked up by somebody. So, if you're interested in seeing more on this, on the Canadian Water Network site, there is a synthesis report which talks about the high-level learnings from this whole Canadian Watershed Research Consortium. But there also are individual reports for the 6 nodes that talk about what they tried to do and what they actually ended up recommending as a monitoring framework. And this is the one for the Northumberland Strait. And if you take that and you simply work through the recommendations that are made in that report, they talk about nutrients, how we need to monitor nitrogen and phosphorus near the head of the estuary this many times and this many estuaries. That's actually all been adopted. DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, is funding the University of Prince Edward Island to collect additional information for the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia estuaries because they don't have nearly as much as Prince Edward Island does. Prince Edward Island actually has a very good program already up and running. DFO is also working to develop a hydrodynamic model to be included with the nutrient work. And there's also this recognition, and we didn't get to this through this project, of internal nutrient loading and phosphorus loading. There's been a number of papers that have come out recently on this, that even if you have a nutrient problem and you stop the nutrient loading, you may still have the same conditions in your estuary or river system for 2, 3, 10 years. And that's because of nutrient remobilization. You've banked all these nutrients in sediments. And we know that that's going to be a problem for us. The reason you need to know that, and you need to know these dynamics, is because it doesn't mean that stopping the nutrient loading is the wrong thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's just that there's going to be a lag before you see the positive results. And so it would guide how you do management. For turbidity and ADCP monitoring at least 2 new rivers per year to further validate sediment load model and so on. That's being done as well. Prince Edward Island is looking into further work on the use of ADCPs to monitor dissolved sediment in the streams. In terms of the indicators of estuarine health, for oxygen and flora, the recommendation hourly measures from the loggers in the top 10% of the estuary and the mid part of the estuary, the 50% area, July to September or even longer if they can manage it. DFO and Prince Edward Island Department of the Environment have said they're going to do that. They're going to take 14 to 16 sites per year on a 3-year. They're talking about whether it's a 3-year or a 4-year water rotation in the estuaries, and some sites yearly so that we can better understand intra-annual variation. Eelgrass, the recommendation is boat-based sonar transects in 5 estuaries on a 5-year rotation. DFO is committed to looking at eelgrass aerial extent. How much eelgrass do we have in our estuaries? They haven't yet committed to this idea of doing it by sonar boat-based. They're thinking about LiDAR, they're thinking about remote sensing, so it may go another way, but they are committed to doing something on eelgrass. Chlorophyll, monitoring multiple times. Although we didn't see much with chlorophyll, we think there's still some promise in that. And DFO thinks so too. They're going to do chlorophyll monitoring in the estuaries, the methods to be decided. And finally, the fauna, the animals. DFO is committed to looking at either fish or invertebrates, and they haven't decided which yet. So on the invertebrates, from the work that Mike Coffin did, we found tremendous variance in the estuaries, and both spatially and temporally, and it requires a huge amount of effort and a high degree of expertise to be able to do these measures. And so we didn't recommend this. DFO is still not sure. In the interim, another grad student, Kyle Knish, working on the contaminants work, has adapted some light traps for use in the estuaries to sample the invertebrates that you find in these areas. And they seem to be quite promising, so that might reduce the amount of work that you need to do these things. So that's a maybe. We didn't talk about this one, brook trout hatching. This is a project that Ashley Alberto did where she took brook trout eggs and put them in the river in cages as a potential index of the impact of sediment in rivers. Wasn't successful. Turns out that the brook trout don't really care about sediment, they care much more about temperature. So that's not recommended and that won't be going ahead. And finally, fish. Again, this is not a recommendation in the NorSt-EMP work, the Northumberland Strait work, but the community aquatic monitoring program that DFO has been doing has undergone a number of different analytical procedures in the last little while. And so DFO is waiting to see the result of that before they decide on the future of the community aquatic monitoring program. So we'll see. With that, I'll wrap it up and take any questions if you have any. Yes?
You talked a lot about the monitoring component of this, but initially you said one of the things that intrigued you about one day was then how the monitoring is feeding back into the management. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on are there currently management or policy initiatives underway within the catchments to improve loading into the rivers? And then how is this monitoring information being fed into that?
one of the frustrating things about working with government, and not that there are any, I used to work for government. I worked for DFO for 25 years, so I'm sympathetic to their problems. At the beginning of all this, I said that we went and talked to RCOM, the Regional Committee on Coastal and Ocean Management, which was this committee that was formed of all the people who have to think about decisions, government decisions in the coastal zone. And we asked them, if we do this, would you support this? Basically, would you adopt this and make this real? Well, in the interim, RCOM ceased to be, right? So that Regional Committee on Coastal and Ocean Management doesn't exist anymore. And they're now looking at different ways of doing things. This is the difficulty. Everybody kind of goes back to their corner and does things the way they always did them. While everybody saw the value at the time, now they say, well, DFO's priority at the moment is marine environmental quality, MEQ. This is under something they have called the Oceans Act. Under MEQ, they need to design standards and responses to nutrient impacts. That's what they've decided is the most important thing. So they're doing a lot of the things that we're talking about. They are looking at the eelgrass as an indicator for nutrient impacts. They are looking at the nutrients themselves. They'll continue doing that, so there will be monitoring of that. But will they do it through this partnership, this stakeholder mechanism that we designed? No, they won't. They'll do it in their own way. And similarly with Prince Edward Island Environment, and DFO and PEI Environment may work a bit together. But basically the answer that I got back from DFO people was, we can do the monitoring ourselves. We don't need help, right? And that to me was disappointing, because the whole point of the partnership isn't just, do you need more help with the monitoring? It's, what is your legitimacy? What is your validity to all of this? Who said, right? Who had a voice? This is giving voice to the people who will be most affected. So just to wrap that up, we're going to come back to that. Mike and I had a sit down with Healthy Land and Water and talked to Paul Maxwell about this, and we've talked to the people at the Australian Rivers Institute who are working on this stuff. And we think that the next step is this report card. You can't bring these people back together without something to do. And the something to do would be the development of a report card.
I suppose like you're reporting on the condition of things, but is that then feeding back into water quality improvement planning that's occurring within the catchments? Because in Australia, obviously, in Moreton Bay and the Brook catchments, there's a huge amount of money that's been put into actually improvements within the catchments, and using the monitoring as an indicator of that management initiative. So there's not a sort of comparable management occurring within the catchments to sort of improve their condition?
Not in the same way. There is management, but it's not as well coordinated, certainly, as what you've got with Healthy Land and Water. I mean, some of the things that you're talking about here with offsets, an offset program that Jim Smart is working on, for example, is really exciting. But you have to have everybody pointing the same direction for that, right? No, we're not to that point yet. Yes.
Following up on this business of finding a market for your wisdom, check out the Chesapeake Bay,
yes.
Which had very similar problems, and found that while there wasn't unity of interest amongst all the stakeholders, the key stakeholders, in that case, you have potato growers, and it's not really in their interest to increase the nitrogen levels in the estuary because they're buying it. What we found in the Chesapeake Bay was that homeowners could be encouraged to apply their spring fertilizer to lawns a couple of weeks later and get better lawns, paying less for fertilizer and having it not drain to the rivers. In the case of the farmers, there was opposition. The pig and chicken growers were happy to dispose of nitrogen into the environment. The farmers, again, were buyers. So the trick then was to find a way for the chicken and pig nitrogen producers to sell their nitrogen to the crop growers, who then didn't have to buy it from outside. So in short, a regional approach of finding who's on your side and who can be sucked in may be better than trying to please everybody all the time.
I love that. One of the things that Kelly McKittrick and I always argue about is whether government leads or follows in these sorts of things. And it matters, because it's who you talk to first. And the feeling is that industry may actually lead on this just for the reasons that you're talking about before government does. One of the encouraging things is that Cavendish Farms, a company run by the Irvings, there's a mafia on the East Coast. There's the Irving family, which owns everything. And they have a lot of sway in this. They've just recently hired the former agriculture minister from the PEI government, who came to the end of his term, was ready to retire, and they managed to hire him back. And he's a very enlightened individual. Horace, isn't he? And we're very hopeful that they will do some of these things. It's going to be changing the kinds of potatoes that you grow, developing those markets, all that kind of stuff. But there are certainly ways that you can put less nutrient into the water. And I think they realize the writing's on the wall, and they will probably do that before they are made to do
that. I have one question because with the agriculture, because not only the nitrogen, but also pesticides and herbicides. And did you try to measure this in the water? And because they can also affect the biodiversity in the water.
Absolutely. So herbicides and pesticides, all the biocides, is a part that wasn't covered in this work, but it's part of a separate Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council strategic grant that Mike Van den Heuvel has. And Kyle Knish is the PhD student working on that. So yes, there are studies going on. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there's been some nice work by, I'm going to blank on this, one of Joseph Cobb's students at the Canadian Rivers Institute, in which he was able to show that there's an interaction between pesticide application and nutrients. So if you're looking at impacts of, and of course it's never one substance, you know, they're exposed to 8, 10, 12 different substances at the same time. But the impact of that mixture is different in an oligotrophic environment than it is in a eutrophic environment. So it's very complicated, yeah. And some of that work is ongoing now, just first steps.
So you mentioned cumulative effects assessment and developing a model for cumulative effects, but you also mentioned that was sort of like the fourth sort of like you're reading at 2 years starting with the baseline. How far
are we on that?
Yeah, like where does that fit in?
It's interesting. We had a contractor come in and look at what had happened in the Canadian Watershed Research Consortium and did exactly that. He said, okay, well, here's Kelly's 4 steps, and here's the 6 projects. You know, if we fill in those boxes, where is it green, where is it yellow, where is it red? Green basically accomplished, yellow on the track, red, you didn't do anything on that. The first column is all green. So everybody developed the monitoring program. They developed baseline data, recommendations for how you collect that baseline data, identify the vaccine, all that kind of stuff. They did that. When you get to developing the triggers, some of the, St. John Harbour a little bit, because they said mean plus or minus 2 standard deviations is going to be their triggers. So they kind of did, but they didn't actually say what would happen at those trigger points, right? So they get a yellow. Most other groups get a red. And in fact, for the rest of the way up, it's red. The exception being in that 3rd column, which is developing stressor-effect relationships. Some work was done there in most places. We have started to better understand what drives change in some of the things that we care about. So, and these things are not necessarily sequential. They can all happen at the same time. But what they are is increasing the amount of time and effort that it takes to do it, right? So, where are we? We're at 1.5 out of 4. Yes.
One of the challenges that I've had in Australia in terms of water quality improvement is that there hasn't been acted to put in regulations by the government. It's been primarily driven by voluntary uptake of these best management practices. So I'm wondering, because you started with talking about Trudeau being more pro-environment, it obviously comes from the Liberal government. Is there, I mean, what is that government's feelings about putting in regulations to sort of help with environmental improvement?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. We have a really good environmental effects monitoring program in Canada for pulp and paper mills and for metal mines. We're talking about a program like that for wastewater treatment plants. There is a program for It's not as prescriptive and universal for offshore oil and gas. And we have a program for aquaculture as well, salmon aquaculture. But I don't see a lot in that area right now. I'm not an expert on that, but I don't see that as the way that things will go. Yes?
Do you have any historical data about the land use on these islands? I mean, can you relate somehow the data that you have on biodiversity in the water with the history of land use history of agriculture on the island?
Yeah, we do. And there is pretty good historic data for Prince Edward Island and pretty good current land use data. Not so good for New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, which maybe there's less problem there, but maybe we know less about it, so there's less problem there too. So, but for Prince Edward Island, there is pretty good information on that now.
All right, there's no further questions. Thank you very much. If anyone does have any other questions for Simon, you're in the country for a little longer, aren't you?
I am. Yeah,
he's over at Griffith Nathan doing
right.
some work, so you can email him or, so thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.